The German Shepherd suddenly lunged forward, his sharp teeth sinking into the handle of a sleek metal suitcase sliding across the polished airport floor. Passengers screamed and scrambled backward as the massive dog dragged a well-dressed man to the ground with terrifying force. Police officers nearby instinctively reached for their holsters, their hands hovering over their weapons as chaos erupted in the middle of the busy terminal. For a moment, no one understood what was happening until the dog refused to let go, growling with a fury his handler had never seen before. "Rex, leave it!" The officer shouted, pulling desperately on the leash, but the canine's instinct was deaf to the command. Something inside that suitcase was wrong, dangerously wrong. The man on the floor kicked at the dog, his face twisted in panic and rage. "Get this beast off me," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You are destroying a life-saving organ. That case contains a human heart for a transplant patient." The crowd gasped, and the atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly from fear to outrage. A human heart. The dog was attacking a medical courier. The handler officer, Jack Reynolds, felt the blood drain from his face as he looked down at his partner, who was now pinning the silver case to the floor with his paws. Rex was not listening. He was not stopping. And as Jack looked into the dog's eyes, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. It was not aggression. It was desperation. The morning had started with the deceptive calm of a Tuesday at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. At 8 o'clock, the terminal was already humming with the rhythmic sound of rolling luggage and the low murmur of thousands of travelers. Officer Jack Reynolds stood near the security checkpoint, adjusting his uniform while holding the leather leash of his partner Titan. Titan was a 6-year-old German Shepherd with a coat the color of burnt timber and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They were a legendary team in the department. In 6 years of service, Titan had never made a mistake. He had found narcotics wrapped in coffee grounds, explosives hidden in electronics, and once even tracked a lost child through 3 miles of parking garages. Jack trusted Titan more than he trusted most people. He checked his watch and sighed. He was 50 years old, and retirement was less than 6 months away. He looked down at Titan, who was sitting calmly beside him, watching the stream of passengers with a stoic expression. "Good boy," Jack whispered, patting the dog's thick neck. "Just a few more hours and we can go home." Titan looked up and gave a small thump of his tail against the floor. To anyone watching, they looked like the picture of order and discipline. The leash in Jack's hand was loose, a sign of the absolute control he had over the animal. Titan did not need to be restrained because Titan did not react without cause. The air smelled of stale coffee and jet fuel mixed with the expensive perfume of business travelers rushing to first class. Jack scanned the crowd, his eyes moving from face to face, looking for the telltale signs of nervousness or deception. Sweat on the brow, avoiding eye contact, gripping a bag too tightly. But the flow of people was normal. A group of college students laughing near the coffee shop, a mother trying to corral 2 toddlers, a flight crew walking in brisk formation. It was boring, and boring was good. Boring meant everyone was safe. Then the automatic doors slid open and the atmosphere shifted. A man stepped into the terminal, and even from 50 feet away he demanded attention. He was tall, wearing a tailored Italian suit that probably cost more than Jack's car. He moved with the arrogant confidence of someone who is used to bypassing lines and breaking rules. He dragged a single piece of luggage behind him, a silver metallic suitcase that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was not a normal carry-on. It was reinforced heavy and plastered with bright red stickers that read, "Emergency medical transport and handle with care." Jack watched the man approach mostly out of habit, but then he felt a tug on the leash. It was subtle at first, a tightening of the slack. He looked down and frowned. Titan had stood up. The dog was no longer relaxed. His body had gone rigid. His muscles coiled under his fur like steel cables. His ears were pricked forward, swiveling like radar dishes toward the man in the suit. Jack felt a flicker of unease. "Easy, Titan," he murmured, thinking the dog might be reacting to the hustle of the crowd. But Titan did not relax. As the man drew closer, walking briskly toward the priority security lane, Titan did something he had never done in his entire career. He did not sniff the air for drugs. He did not sit to signal explosives. Instead, the hair along his spine stood straight up, forming a jagged ridge. A low rumble started deep in his chest, a sound so primal and vibrating that Jack could feel it travel up the leash and into his own arm. This was not the signal for contraband. This was the signal for a predator. This was the signal Titan used when he sensed a direct threat to life. Jack tightened his grip, wrapping the leather strap around his hand. Titan, stand down, he ordered, his voice firm. But the dog's eyes were locked on the man in the suit. Specifically, they were locked on the silver case. The man was now only 20 feet away. He glanced at the police officer and the growling dog, and for a split second his rhythm faltered. He checked his watch nervously and pulled the suitcase closer to his leg. That small movement was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Without a bark or a warning, Titan launched himself forward. The power of the lunge was so explosive that it nearly pulled Jack off his feet. The leather leash snapped tight, cutting into Jack's gloves, but it wasn't enough to stop 80 pounds of muscle moving with lethal intent. Titan did not go for the man's throat or his arm. He went low. He went for the case. The collision was violent. Titan slammed into the man's legs, knocking him sideways. The man shouted in shock, his arms flailing as he hit the hard tile floor. The silver suitcase flew from his grip, sliding across the linoleum. But before it could slide far, Titan was on it. He clamped his jaws onto the heavy plastic handle, his teeth scraping against the metal reinforcements. He planted his paws firmly on the top of the case, growling ferociously, daring anyone to touch it. The terminal erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the air. Travelers dropped their bags and scrambled away, tripping over each other in their haste to escape what looked like a vicious animal attack. Security alarms began to blare, a rhythmic whooping sound that added to the confusion. Jack recovered his balance and lunged toward his dog. "Titan, release!" he roared, his voice cracking with the strain. "Release now!" But Titan did not release. He bit down harder, his growls turning into snarls. He was shaking the heavy case, trying to drag it away from the fallen man. The man, whose name was Julian Thorne, scrambled to his feet. His expensive suit was torn at the knee, and his face was red with fury. He did not run away as a criminal might. Instead, he lunged toward the dog in the case. "You crazy animal, get away from that," he yelled. Jack stepped between them, shoving Julian back with one hand while trying to grab Titan's collar with the other. "Sir, stay back," he ordered. Julian ignored him, pointing a trembling finger at the suitcase. "That creates a sterile environment. If the seal breaks, the heart inside will die. You are killing a patient right now." The words echoed through the terminal. A heart. The crowd, which had been retreating, stopped. Smartphones were raised like 1,000 tiny eyes, recording every second. The narrative shifted instantly. This wasn't a brave police dog stopping a bad guy. This was a wild beast destroying a medical miracle. Jack felt the weight of 100 accusing stares. He grabbed Titan's collar with both hands, pulling with all his strength. "Titan, stand down." That is a direct order. For the first time in 6 years, Titan ignored him. The dog planted his feet, his claws scratching white lines into the polished floor. He wasn't attacking the man anymore. He was pinning the suitcase down, using his entire body weight to cover it. He looked up at Jack and let out a sound that Jack had never heard before. It wasn't a growl. It was a high-pitched keen, a sound of pure distress. His eyes were wide, the whites visible, rimmed with red. He looked terrified. Jack froze. He knew this dog better than he knew his own wife. Titan wasn't being disobedient. He was pleading. He was trying to tell Jack something that the training commands didn't cover, but the world wasn't looking at Titan's eyes. They were looking at his teeth. "Officer, get control of your animal, or I will sue this entire department into oblivion," Julian screamed, stepping forward again. "I have a charter plane waiting. A little girl in New York is waiting for this heart. Do you want her blood on your hands?" The crowd began to shout. "Let him go. Get the dog away. Shame on you." The voices merged into a wall of hostility. Jack felt sweat trickle down his back. He was losing control of the situation. He looked at Julian, who was checking his watch with frantic obsession. The man seemed terrified, but not of the dog. He was terrified of the delay. "Sir, I need you to step back," Jack repeated, trying to keep his voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "My dog is reacting to something in this bag. We need to clear the area." "There is nothing in there but a human organ on ice," Julian spat back. "And if you don't call off your wolf, I will take that gun from your belt and shoot him myself." Titan reacted to the threat instantly. He didn't lunge at Julian, but he snapped his jaws at the air between them, a clear warning bite that sounded like a gunshot. Julian flinched and stumbled back, falling over a row of waiting chairs. The crowd screamed again. Jack realized he had run out of time. He couldn't wrestle Titan off the bag without hurting him, and Titan clearly wasn't going to leave voluntarily. He had to make a choice. Trust the man in the suit with the sob story, or trust the partner who had saved his life 3 times. He looked at the suitcase. It was dented from the fall, but still sealed. Titan was now lying on top of it, panting heavily, his nose pressed against the seam where the 2 halves of the shell met. He was sniffing frantically, inhaling deep drafts of air, then exhaling with a whimper. Jack made his decision. He unclipped the leash from his belt, but kept a tight hold on the collar. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds at Terminal 4. I have a canine alert on a piece of luggage. I need backup and a containment team immediately." Julian's face went pale. "You're calling containment? For a heart. You idiot, you're going to kill it." Jack looked him dead in the eye. "If it's a heart, sir, we will get it on that plane with a police escort. But my dog thinks there is something else in there, and he is never wrong." Titan whined again, a long, mournful sound that cut through the noise of the terminal. He pressed his cheek against the cold metal of the suitcase as if he was trying to listen to something inside. Jack watched him, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. Titan wasn't guarding contraband. He was protecting something. But what could possibly be inside a sealed medical case that would make a police dog cry? The backup arrived in a wave of blue uniforms. Captain Miller, the head of airport security, pushed through the crowd, his face thunderous. "Reynolds, what is the meaning of this?" he barked, gesturing to the scene. "We have a VIP complaint coming from the senator's office about a medical transport being harassed." "Captain, my K9 alerted on this bag," Jack said, standing his ground. "He attacked the bag physically," Miller asked incredulously, looking at the scratches on the metal. "That is a failure of protocol, Reynolds. That is a dangerous animal." "He is not dangerous," Jack said, stepping in front of Titan. "He is signaling. Look at him, Captain." Miller looked. Titan had stopped growling at the crowd. He was entirely focused on the suitcase. He was licking the metal seam gently, almost tenderly. It was a bizarre shift in behavior. 1 minute a wolf, the next a nurse. "Get the dog away from the bag," Miller ordered. "We are going to scan it and get this man on his flight." Jack bent down to Titan's ear. "Buddy, you have to let me look," he whispered. Titan looked at him, his amber eyes filled with an intelligence that was almost human. He didn't move. Jack had to physically wrap his arms around the dog's chest and drag him backward. Titan fought him, digging his claws into the floor, howling as he was separated from the case. It took 2 other officers to help restrain him. They dragged him 10 feet away and pinned him to the floor. Titan stopped fighting the moment he was pinned, but he kept his eyes glued to the suitcase, whining incessantly. Julian rushed forward, dusting off his suit. Finally, he muttered, reaching for the handle. "Don't touch it!" Jack shouted. Julian froze. Captain Miller stepped in. "Run the portable X-ray. Now! Let's verify the contents and end this circus." A technician rolled a portable scanner over the suitcase. The crowd held its breath. Julian looked confident, crossing his arms over his chest. But Jack noticed a bead of sweat rolling down the man's temple despite the air-conditioned chill of the terminal. The technician looked at the monitor and frowned. "Captain, I can't get a clear image. The case is lined with lead." "Of course it's lined with lead," Julian snapped. "It's to protect the organ from radiation during the flight. Do you people know nothing about medical transport?" Miller looked at Jack. "The lead lining explains why the dog might be confused. He can't smell through lead." Jack shook his head. "Lead blocks radiation, Captain. It doesn't block smell, and it doesn't block sound. Titan hears something, or he smells something that is leaking out." Julian laughed a short, nervous sound. "Leaking. It's a hermetically sealed unit. Nothing leaks." "Then why is my dog acting like he's found a survivor in a collapsed building?" Jack asked quietly. The reference made the other officers pause. They all knew Titan's history. Before he was a drug dog, he had been a search and rescue dog. He had pulled people out of earthquakes. The signal for finding a live human was different than the signal for finding drugs. Drugs made him sit. Bombs made him lay down. Finding a person made him bark. Titan let out a sharp bark, then another, then a long pause, then another bark. Jack's blood ran cold. "That's a distress signal," he whispered. Captain Miller looked from the dog to the suitcase. He saw the desperation in Titan's posture. He saw the sweat on Julian's face. "Open it," Miller said. "You can't open it," Julian shrieked, stepping in front of the case. "You will break the sterile seal. The heart will be contaminated. You will be murdering a patient. I will have your badges. All of you. Miller hesitated. The threat was real. If they opened a medical transport and destroyed a donor organ, the legal and public relations fallout would be catastrophic. But if they let a bomb on a plane, it would be worse. Jack saw the hesitation. He knew he was about to end his career. He looked at Titan. The dog was trembling, vibrating with a need to get back to that case. Jack, trust him. I'm opening it, Jack said, stepping forward. Reynolds, stand down. Miller warned, his hand moving to his taser. Jack ignored him. He reached for the latch on the suitcase. Julian lunged at him, throwing a punch that caught Jack on the jaw. Jack didn't even flinch. He shoved Julian backwards, sending him sprawling into the arms of the other officers. Hold him, Jack roared. He knelt by the case. It was locked with a heavy digital keypad. He didn't have the code. He drew his baton. Don't do it, Reynolds Miller shouted. Jack raised the baton. Titan barked one last time, a sound of pure encouragement. Jack brought the baton down on the lock with all his strength. Metal crunched. Sparks flew. He hit it again and again, shattering the plastic casing of the digital lock. Julian was screaming now, a raw primal sound of panic. No, 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 don't look. Jack jammed the end of the baton into the broken mechanism and pried. The metal groaned. The latches popped open with a loud snap. The lid hissed as the pressure seal broke. A puff of cold vapor escaped from the crack. The smell hit Jack first. It wasn't the metallic smell of blood or the chemical smell of preservatives. It was a sweet smell, warm and familiar. It smelled like warm milk and baby powder. He threw the lid back. The crowd leaned in. The officers drew their weapons, expecting a bomb. Captain Miller braced himself for the sight of a human heart, but there was no heart. Inside the suitcase, nestled among high-tech machinery and blinking lights, was a glass compartment, and inside that compartment, wrapped in thermal blankets, was a baby. A human baby. The infant was tiny, maybe 3 months old. It was blue. Its eyes were closed and it wasn't moving. A tube was taped to its small face, connected to a gas canister. The machine next to it was humming softly, but a red light was flashing on the console. Error. Oxygen low. The silence that fell over the terminal was absolute. It was a silence heavier than any scream. Then Titan broke it. He broke free from the officers holding him and ran to the open suitcase. He didn't bite. He didn't bark. He gently nudged the baby's tiny, motionless hand with his wet nose. He whined softly, licking the blue fingers. Jack fell to his knees. Medic, he screamed, his voice tearing at his throat. We have a baby! Julian tried to run, but he didn't get far. Captain Miller tackled him with a force that cracked the floor tiles. Jack watched as the paramedics swarmed the suitcase. He watched as they pulled the tiny, limp body out of the machine. He saw the chest rise and a shallow, jagged breath. The baby was alive. Barely. Titan lay down next to the empty suitcase, his head on his paws, watching the paramedics work. He looked exhausted. He looked at Jack and gave a slow, tired wag of his tail. Jack reached out and rested his hand on the dog's head, burying his fingers in the thick fur. You knew, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. You knew it wasn't a heart. You knew it was a heartbeat. The airport was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of radios crying civilians and the rush of medical equipment. But in the center of the storm, Branch and his dog sat together, guarding the empty shell that had almost become a coffin. Titan had risked everything. He had attacked a human. He had disobeyed his handler. He had broken every rule in the book, and because he did, a child was going to live. The sound of heavy boots hitting the linoleum floor echoed like thunder rolling through the terminal. It wasn't just backup, it was an invasion. The perimeter that Jack had tried to establish was shattered in an instant as the airport tactical response team swarmed the area. They moved with the terrifying precision of soldiers entering a war zone. Their faces were hidden behind ballistic visors, and their body armor was bulky and black. At the center of the formation marched Captain Miller. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't look like a colleague anymore. He looked like an executioner. Reynolds dropped the leash. Miller roared, his voice booming over the remnants of the crowd's murmurs. Jack looked up from where he was kneeling beside Titan. He saw the barrels. 4 tactical rifles were raised, and they weren't pointed at the ceiling. They were pointed directly at Titan's head. The red laser sights danced across the dog's dark fur, settling on his chest and his muzzle. Titan froze. For the first time, the dog seemed to realize that the humans surrounding him were not his pack. They were threats. He let out a low, uncertain whine, pressing his body harder against the silver suitcase as if trying to shield it with his own flesh. "Captain, he is not attacking!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He is signaling. Look at his tail. Look at his ears. I don't care what he is doing," Miller spat back, stepping closer. "He assaulted a civilian. He is compromising a federal medical transport. Stand down, Reynolds, or you will be removed by force." The air in the terminal felt like it had been sucked out of the room. The standoff had escalated from a misunderstanding to a potential tragedy in the blink of an eye. The tactical team tightened their circle, their fingers resting on the triggers of their automatic weapons. One wrong move, one sudden lunge from Titan, and the floor would be stained with blood. Julian Thorne, seeing the arrival of the cavalry, suddenly found his courage. He scrambled up from the floor, dusting off his expensive Italian suit with trembling hands. His face was no longer pale with shock. It was flushed with the arrogant indignation of a man who knows he has the upper hand. He didn't look at Jack. He looked straight at Captain Miller, his eyes narrowing with cold calculation. "Captain Miller." "I presume," Julian said, his voice dripping with authority. "I am Dr. Julian Thorne. I am a senior courier for the United Nations Medical Organ Task Force." He reached into his jacket pocket. The tactical team flinched, rifles adjusting, but Julian moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a leather folio and flipped it open. He thrust it toward Miller's face. Inside, the documents looked unimpeachable. There was the heavy, cream-colored paper of official diplomatic correspondence. There were watermarks that caught the fluorescent light, shimmering with authenticity. And there, right at the top, was the undeniable bright red stamp of the United Nations Health Council, marked with the words, "Priority 1 Critical Transit." Below it was a secondary seal from the Department of Homeland Security, authorizing immediate bypass of standard screening protocols for biological transport. Miller stared at the papers. His eyes scanned the seals, the signatures, the imposing blocks of legal text that promised severe federal imprisonment for anyone obstructing the courier. The color drained from Miller's face. He wasn't looking at a crime scene anymore. He was looking at a career-ending lawsuit. He was looking at an international diplomatic incident. "Do you know what is in that case?" Captain Julian hissed, his voice rising so the cameras in the crowd could hear him. "It is a pediatric heart, a viable living heart for a 6-year-old girl in New York City. She is on the operating table right now. Her chest is open. She is waiting for me. And every second your incompetent officer and his rabid wolf keep me here is a second closer to her death." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The narrative had been spun perfectly. Julian wasn't just a victim, he was a savior. And Jack and Titan were the monsters standing in the way of a miracle. Miller turned his gaze slowly to Jack. His expression had hardened into something cold and final. "Reynolds, you have exactly 5 seconds to drag that mutt away from the evidence. If you do not, I will authorize the team to neutralize the threat." Jack felt his stomach drop. Neutralize. It was a sterile word for killing his best friend. He looked at Titan. The dog was trembling now. The adrenaline of the attack was fading, replaced by confusion and fear. Titan looked at the guns, then at Miller, then at Jack. He didn't understand why the good guys were threatening him. He didn't understand why his warning was being ignored. He licked his lips nervously and let out a soft, high-pitched yip that sounded nothing like a police dog and everything like a frightened puppy. Jack moved his body, shifting so he was physically blocking the line of fire between the SWAT team and Titan. He felt the heat of the laser sights on his own back now. "Captain, please," Jack begged, his voice lowering to a hoarse whisper. "Look at the papers again. Look closely. Since when does a UN courier travel commercial without an escort? Since when does a heart transplant arrive in a briefcase that isn't temperature monitored on the outside?" "I don't have time for your conspiracy theories," Reynolds Miller snapped. "The paperwork is valid. The threat is real." Julian stepped forward, emboldened by Miller's support. He pointed a manicured finger at Titan. "That animal is dangerous. He has tasted human blood. He bit me. Look at my arm." He held up his sleeve. The fabric was torn and there was a small smear of blood. It was a superficial scratch from Titan's warning snap, but Julian displayed it like a war wound. By law, that animal must be put down. Julian declared, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. "He is unstable. He is a liability. If you let him live, he will attack again. I demand you shoot him. Right now, before he destroys the organ." The demand hung in the air, brutal and absolute. "Shoot him." Jack's hand dropped to his belt. He didn't reach for his service weapon. He reached for his taser. He unclipped it and held it down by his side, his thumb hovering over the safety. It was a gesture of mutiny, a gesture that said he was ready to fight his own team to save his dog. If anyone fires a shot, Jack said, his voice eerily calm, quieter than the shouting around him, "If anyone pulls a trigger on this dog, you will have to go through me first." Miller's eyes widened. He saw the taser in Jack's hand. He saw the resolve in the older officer's posture. This was a man with nothing left to lose, a man who was 5 months from retirement and was willing to burn it all down. Reynolds put the weapon away. Miller warned, his hand drifting toward his own holster. "You are crossing a line you can't come back from." "I am not the one crossing the line," Jack replied. "We are making a mistake, Captain. A massive mistake. Titan isn't attacking the bag because he's crazy. He's attacking it because he smells something that doesn't belong. He smells death, Captain, or he smells life, but he doesn't smell a heart on ice." Julian laughed, a sharp barking sound of derision. "Listen to him. He's hallucinating. He's projecting his own incompetence onto a dumb animal. Captain, are you going to let a dog dictate airport security policy while a child dies?" The pressure on Miller was immense. The crowd was screaming. The diplomat was threatening. The dog was growling. And his own officer was threatening mutiny. He had to act. He had to restore order. Miller took a deep breath. "Sergeant," he said to the lead SWAT officer, "secure Officer Reynolds, remove the K-9, use tranquilizers if necessary, but clear that bag. Now." The tactical team moved. They stepped forward in unison, their heavy boots closing the circle. Titan sensed the shift in aggression. He stopped whining. He stood up over the suitcase, his posture changing instantly from submissive to defensive. He bared his teeth, a low guttural snarl ripping from his throat. He wasn't going to let them take the bag. He was going to fight. Jack saw the muscles bunch in Titan's hind legs. He knew what was about to happen. Titan was going to launch at the nearest threat, which was the SWAT sergeant, and the moment he was in the air, they would shoot him. "No," Jack screamed, throwing himself onto his knees, wrapping his arms around Titan's thick neck. He buried his face in the dog's fur, holding him down with all his weight. "No, don't shoot. I've got him. I've got him," he whispered frantically into Titan's ear, his tears wetting the coarse fur. "Don't move, buddy. Please don't move. They'll kill you." Titan struggled for a second, trying to break free to get back to the suitcase. But he felt Jack's distress. He felt the shaking of his handler's body. The bond between them held. Titan stopped fighting. He let Jack hold him down, but he never took his eyes off Julian. He let out a long, heartbreaking howl, a sound of pure frustration and sorrow that echoed up to the high ceiling of the terminal. It was the sound of a guardian who knew he had failed. Miller signaled the team to lower their weapons, but kept them ready. "Get them out of here," Miller ordered, pointing to a secure side door. "Get them into holding room B, and get that bag to the X-ray machine immediately." Julian smirked, straightening his tie. Finally, some competence. As Jack dragged a reluctant, stumbling Titan away, the dog twisted his head back one last time. He looked at the silver suitcase, now being picked up by a gloved officer. He looked at Julian, who was watching with a predator's smile. And Titan barked. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a snarl. It was 3 short, sharp barks, followed by a long pause. Then 3 more. Jack froze in the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew that signal. Every handler in the unit knew that signal. It wasn't the signal for drugs. It wasn't the signal for bombs. It was the signal Titan had learned in his first year of training. The training he had received before he became a police dog, when he was part of the urban search and rescue team. It was the signal for a live victim trapped under rubble. Titan wasn't attacking the suitcase. He was trying to rescue someone inside it. The heavy metal door of the sterile holding room slammed shut with a finality that echoed in Jack's chest like a gavel striking a death sentence. The room was cold white and smelled faintly of bleach and old fear. In the center of the room sat the silver suitcase placed on a steel table by a wary bomb technician who had immediately retreated to the far wall. Titan was pinned in the corner, his leash tethered to a heavy bolt in the floor, but his body was straining toward that table with a force that threatened to snap the leather strap. Captain Miller stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of impatient fury. He checked his watch, a gesture that felt like a countdown to the end of Jack's career. "You have exactly 3 minutes," Reynolds Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "That medical transport has to be on the runway in 10. The pilot is holding the engines. The senator is on line 1 screaming at the commissioner. This ends now." Jack looked at his superior officer, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Ends how?" Captain Miller pointed a gloved finger at the medical pouch on Jack's utility belt. "Sedate the animal. Give him the full dose of ketamine. Knock him out, drag him to the squad car, and let this man take his cargo. If I hear one more bark from that dog, I will have animal control euthanize him as a public safety risk before the sun goes down." The ultimatum hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Sedate him. It wasn't just an order to calm a dog. It was an order to silence a witness. Jack looked at Julian Thorne, who was standing behind the captain, smoothing the wrinkles in his expensive suit. Julian didn't look like a man worried about a dying patient anymore. He looked like a man who had won a high-stakes bet. He caught Jack's eye and offered a thin, cold smile, tapping his wrist to indicate the time. Jack reached for his pouch. His fingers felt thick and clumsy as he unbuttoned the flap. He pulled out the syringe and the small vial of sedative. It was standard issue for canine handlers meant for emergencies when a dog was critically injured and needed to be immobilized to save its life. It was never meant to be used like this. It was never meant to be a silencer. Titan saw the syringe. He knew what it was. He had been sedated before when he tore his flank on a chain-link fence chasing a suspect 2 years ago, but he didn't back away. He didn't cower. Instead, the German Shepherd did something that made Jack's heart stop in his chest. Titan stopped growling. The room fell into a sudden, unnerving silence. The deep guttural vibration that had filled the air for the last 20 minutes vanished. Titan sat down. He looked at Jack, and then he looked at the silver suitcase. His ears usually pricked and alert folded back against his skull in a gesture of pure submission and sorrow. And then he began to cry. It started as a low whine vibrating in his throat, then rose to a high-pitched, broken whimper. It wasn't the sound of a vicious animal. It wasn't the sound of an aggressive predator. It was the sound of a creature in absolute despair. It was the sound a dog makes when it is left alone in the dark. Jack froze the needle hovering in his hand. He had trained Titan for 6 years. He knew every sound this dog made. He knew the bark for drugs, the sit for bombs, the growl for threat. He had never not once heard Titan make a sound like this. "Look at him," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. "Captain, look at him. He's not attacking. He's grieving. Just do it." Reynolds Miller shouted, his patience snapping. But Jack couldn't move. He watched as Titan, still whimpering, lowered his head to the cold linoleum floor. The dog extended his front paws and began to scratch. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound of claws on tile was sharp and rhythmic. Titan wasn't scratching at the air. He was scratching at the floor, dragging his nails toward the table where the suitcase sat. He dug harder. The friction was too much for the smooth surface. One of his claws cracked. A smear of bright red blood appeared on the white tile. Titan didn't stop. He kept digging, his eyes fixed on the suitcase, tears of exertion and panic forming in the corners of his dark eyes. Jack dropped the syringe. It clattered to the floor, rolling away under a chair. "He isn't trying to destroy it," Jack said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "He's trying to get to it. He's trying to dig." Miller stepped forward, his hand resting on his taser. "He is insane, Reynolds. He is damaging government property. Step aside." "No," Jack said. He turned his back on the captain, facing his dog. He walked slowly toward Titan, ignoring Miller's shouted warnings. He knelt in front of the bleeding, whimpering animal. He took Titan's face in his hands. The dog was trembling so violently that Jack's own arms began to shake. Titan licked Jack's hands, smearing a little blood on his uniform, then looked back at the suitcase and gave a short, sharp yelp. Jack looked at the blood on the floor. He looked at the desperate, pleading eyes of his partner. And suddenly the pieces clicked into place. The pieces that didn't fit the narrative of a drug bust or a bomb threat. This behavior wasn't from Titan's narcotics training. It wasn't from his patrol training. It was from before. It was from the time when Titan was a puppy trained for urban disaster recovery. This was the behavior of a dog standing on top of a collapsed building, smelling a heartbeat buried under 10 feet of concrete. "He's digging." Jack whispered, his voice rising in horror.
He's digging because he thinks something is buried in there. He turned to face Miller and Julian, his eyes blazing. That's not a heart in a box, Jack said, his voice steady and cold. You don't dig for a transplant organ. You dig for a survivor. Julian's composure cracked. For the first time, the arrogance slipped, revealing a flash of sheer, unadulterated terror. He didn't look at the suitcase. He looked at the door. Captain, this man is hallucinating. Julian screamed, his voice shrill. I am leaving. I am taking my property, and I am leaving. He lunged for the suitcase on the table. Titan reacted faster than thought. He didn't need a command.
He didn't care about the leash. He surged forward, the leather strap snapping taut, the metal bolt in the floor groaning under the strain. He let out a roar that wasn't a bark but a battle cry. Jack didn't stop him. He didn't reach for the leash. He reached for his baton. Miller drew his weapon. Reynolds stand down. Jack ignored the gun pointed at his back. He stepped between Julian and the door, blocking the exit. Nobody leaves, Jack said. Not until I see what my dog is dying to save. The silence that followed Jack's declaration was heavy enough to crush a man. For 10 heartbeats, the only sound in the sterile holding room was the jagged breathing of the German shepherd and the low electrical hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Captain Miller stood frozen, his service weapon leveled at Jack's chest. The barrel did not waver. The safety was off. In the 30 years they had served on the force together through riots, blizzards, and terrorist threats, Miller had never once drawn his weapon on a fellow officer, until now. Reynolds put it down. Miller said, his voice tight and unrecognizable. You are committing a felony. You are holding a federal courier hostage. Do not make me do this. Jack didn't blink. He didn't look at the gun pointed at his heart. His focus was absolute. Slowly, deliberately, his hand moved to his belt. He didn't reach for his Glock. That would be suicide. That would turn this into a shootout. Instead, his fingers closed around the yellow handle of his Taser X-26. He drew it in one smooth motion. The click of the Taser's safety being disengaged sounded like a gunshot in the small room. Julian Thorne let out a strangled yelp and scrambled backward, pressing himself against the far wall, shielding his face with his hands. Jack didn't aim the weapon at Miller. He didn't aim it at Julian. He pointed the red laser dot at the floor, tracing a sharp invisible line in the white tiles between the officers and the table where the silver suitcase sat. He walked around the table, the Taser held low, but ready, carving out a circle of forbidden ground. He stepped inside that circle, placing himself between the world and the box his dog was desperate to open. Nobody crosses this line, Jack said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the cold, hard weight of a tombstone. Nobody touches this bag. Nobody touches my dog. Not until I see what is inside. You've lost your mind, Reynolds. Miller hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger guard. Look at yourself. You are throwing away your pension. You are throwing away your freedom. For what? For a dog having a panic attack. He's not panicking. Jack shot back, his eyes darting to Titan. The dog had stopped scratching for a moment, sensing the escalation in violence. Titan dragged his bleeding body closer to Jack's legs, pressing his weight against his handler's shins, offering support, offering loyalty. Jack could feel the heat radiating off the animal. Look at the floor, Captain. Look at the blood. Jack gestured with his free hand to the smears of bright crimson on the white tile where Titan had torn his own claws apart trying to dig through the floor. Does that look like aggression to you? Does that look like a drug alert? Jack's voice rose, cracking with emotion. A predator doesn't hurt itself to get to prey. A predator conserves energy. This is rescue behavior, Miller. He is trying to save something. He is hurting himself to save whatever is in that box. Miller's eyes flickered to the blood. For a split second, doubt clouded his fury. He knew dogs. He knew canine psychology. Jack was right. Self-mutilation in pursuit of a target was rare, usually a sign of extreme distress or the instinct to protect offspring. But then he looked at Julian Thorne. He saw the expensive suit, the diplomatic papers, the terrified face of a man who claimed to be saving a dying child. The weight of the law crashed back down on Miller's shoulders. The tactical team behind Miller shifted. The sergeant in the lead stepped forward, his rifle raised. Captain, we have a hostile subject. Permission to engage. Jack turned the Taser slightly, the laser dot dancing near the sergeant's boots. Don't do it, he warned. I have 50,000 volts in this cartridge. I might go down, but the first man who steps into this circle is coming down with me. It was madness. It was a mutiny in the middle of an international airport. The air was so thick with tension it tasted like copper. Jack could feel the sweat running down his back, soaking his uniform shirt. He knew how this looked. He looked like a rogue cop who had snapped under pressure. He looked dangerous, but he couldn't stop. He felt a phantom thread connecting his heart to the suitcase, a thread spun by the soul of the dog leaning against his leg. Julian Thorne saw the hesitation in the police ranks. He realized that the chain of command was fracturing. He stepped away from the wall, his face twisting into a sneer of desperate authority. "This is unbelievable!" Julian shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Miller. "You are the captain. You are in charge. Why are you letting this lunatic stall shoot him, taser him, do your job? That heart has a shelf life. Every minute we stand here arguing is a minute you are stealing from a dying 6-year-old girl." The mention of the girl hit Miller like a physical blow. The moral calculus shifted again. One dog versus one child, one career versus a life. "Reynolds, this is your last warning," Miller said, his voice dropping to a flat, deadly monotone. "I am going to count to 3. If you do not holster that weapon and step away from the evidence, we will engage. 1. Jack looked at Miller. They had barbecued together on the 4th of July. Their wives knew each other. They had buried friends together. 2. Jack looked down at Titan. The dog looked up, his muzzle graying with age, his eyes filled with an absolute, unwavering trust. Titan didn't know about laws or lawsuits or pensions. He only knew that there was a heartbeat in the box, and his dad was the only one who could help. Jack took a deep breath. He didn't holster the taser. Instead, he reached up with his free hand to his chest. His fingers found the heavy metal badge pinned to his uniform shirt. The badge he had polished every morning for 30 years. The badge that defined who he was. He unclasped it. The pin came loose with a small click. Jack tossed the badge. It flew through the air, spinning under the fluorescent lights, and landed with a hollow clatter on the floor, sliding to a stop at Captain Miller's feet. "There," Jack said, his voice shaking but clear. "You want my career? Take it. You want my pension? It's yours. I am done. I am not a police officer right now. I am a man who trusts his dog." Miller stared at the badge. The silver shield lay face up, the city seal gleaming accusingly. The countdown died in his throat. "If I am wrong," Jack continued, the words pouring out of him like a confession, "if I open that case and it is just a heart, you can arrest me. You can put me in federal prison for the rest of my life. I will plead guilty. I won't fight you. I will walk into the cell and throw away the key myself." He took a step forward, leaving the protection of the table exposing his chest to the guns. "But if I am right," Jack whispered, staring Miller in the eyes, "if I am right, and you let that man walk out of here with that case, you won't just be ending my career. You will be an accessory to whatever nightmare is inside. Can you live with that, Mike? Can you go home to your kids tonight knowing you chose a piece of paper over a life?" The use of Miller's first name shattered the professional barrier. It wasn't a captain talking to a sergeant anymore. It was 2 men standing on the edge of a precipice. The room was silent. The tactical team weighted their fingers heavy on their triggers. Julian Thorne held his breath, his eyes darting between the badge on the floor and the suitcase on the table. Titan let out one single sharp bark. It broke the spell. Miller lowered his gun. Just an inch. It was enough. He looked at Julian Thorne. He saw the sweat drenching the man's collar. He saw the way Julian's hands were shaking, not with the fear of a man whose patient is dying, but with the fear of a man who has been caught. Miller holstered his weapon. He held up a hand to the SWAT team. "Stand down," he ordered. But Captain the sergeant protested. "Stand down," Miller roared. He looked back at Jack. His face was grim, etched with the knowledge that there was no going back from this. "You have 1 minute," Reynolds Miller said. 1 minute to prove you aren't crazy. And if you're wrong, God help you, because I won't be able to." Jack didn't waste a second. He didn't say thank you. He holstered the taser. He turned to the table. He grabbed the baton he had laid there earlier. Julian shrieked, lunging forward. "No, you can't!" Miller stepped in his path, his arm like an iron bar. "Let him work, Doctor." Jack raised the baton. Titan scrambled to his feet, his tail wagging low and fast, his whines turning into yips of encouragement. Jack looked at the lock. He thought of his career. He thought of his life. And then he swung. The baton never made contact with the silver metal. Just as Jack's arm began its downward arc, a heavy hand clamped onto his wrist, stopping the blow inches from the digital lock. It was Captain Miller. He didn't look angry anymore, he looked tired and grim. "Not here," Miller said, his voice low and urgent under the noise of the shouting crowd. "Look around you, Reynolds. There are 100 cell phones recording this. If you are wrong and you smash that case open right here, you will start a riot. We do this by the book. We do this in private." Jack hesitated, his chest heaving. He looked at the circle of phones, the angry faces of the passengers, who still believed he was the villain attacking a medical courier. He looked at Julian Thorne, who was hyperventilating against the wall, clutching his chest, as if he were the one having a heart attack. Then he looked at Titan. The dog was panting, his tongue lolling out, but his eyes were still locked on the suitcase with a terrifying intensity. "Fine," Jack said, lowering the baton but not holstering it. "We move, but the bag stays with me." They moved as a strange and volatile procession through the terminal. A phalanx of tactical officers formed a tight square, pushing back the curious and the hostile. Inside the square, Julian Thorne walked with his chin high, pulling his suitcase, but his knuckles were white on the handle. Beside him, Jack walked with Titan. It was a struggle with every step. Titan didn't want to heal. He wanted to be on top of that bag. He lunged and pulled his claws, skittering on the polished terrazzo, his body twisted sideways as he tried to keep his nose pointed at the target. They reached the secure corridor that led to the airport's internal holding area. The noise of the crowd faded instantly, cut off by heavy double doors that required a key card and a retinal scan. The silence that followed was sudden and oppressive. The air here smelled different. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee and the cold sweat of people who knew they were in trouble. Miller led them into Interrogation Room B. It was a windowless box designed to break people. The walls were covered in gray soundproofing foam that sucked the life out of any noise. A single stainless steel table was bolted to the floor in the center. A mirror that everyone knew was two-way glass dominated one wall. The lighting was harsh and fluorescent, buzzing with a low frequency that drilled into the skull. Julian slammed the suitcase onto the table with a theatrical huff. There he spat, adjusting his tie. "We are in private. Now are you going to scan it, or are you going to let me leave?" Jack didn't answer. He had a more immediate problem. Titan was going berserk. In the confined space of the room, the dog's energy was overwhelming. He was bouncing off the walls, leaping toward the table, his jaws snapping inches from the suitcase. "Secure the animal," Miller ordered, pointing to a heavy steel ring bolted into the corner of the room. It was meant for handcuffing prisoners to the floor. Now Reynolds. Jack hated doing it. It felt like a betrayal. He dragged Titan to the corner. The dog fought him not with aggression, but with a frantic strength that was hard to overpower. Titan was heavy, 80 pounds of muscle and will. Jack had to use his own body weight to pin the dog against the wall, just long enough to clip the heavy tactical leash onto the steel ring. "I'm sorry, buddy," Jack whispered, his face pressed against the dog's neck. I have to. As soon as the clip snapped shut, Jack stepped back. Titan lunged immediately. The leash snapped taut. The collar dug into his throat, choking him, but he didn't stop. He threw himself against the restraint again and again, his paws scrabbling uselessly on the linoleum. When he realized he couldn't break the chain, he stopped pulling. He turned his body so he was facing the table. He sat down, and then the sound began. It wasn't the barking from the terminal. It wasn't the growling. It started low in his chest, a vibration that Jack felt in the soles of his boots. Titan tilted his head back, his eyes closing tightly as if he were in physical pain. He opened his mouth and let out a howl. It was a long, thin sound. It was hollow. It rose and fell in a minor key, shivering through the soundproofed room like a ghost passing through a wall. It was chilling. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Julian Thorne flinched, covering his ears. "Make it stop," he hissed. "That noise. It's awful." Captain Miller looked at the dog, and for the first time, true uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He rubbed the back of his neck, his hand shaking slightly. "I've never heard a dog make a noise like that," he muttered. Jack had. He stood frozen in the center of the room, the blood draining from his face until he was as pale as the walls. His hands fell to his sides, his baton clattering to the floor, forgotten. He stared at Titan, and his mind was suddenly dragged back 3 years into the past. He was back in the rubble of the collapsed apartment building on the south side. It had been a gas explosion. The air had been thick with gray dust that tasted like pulverized concrete and sorrow. Titan had been younger then, a search and rescue prodigy. They had worked for 12 hours straight climbing over unstable beams and shattered glass. Titan had found 4 survivors that day. Each time he found someone alive, he would bark a sharp staccato rhythm that sounded like hope. But then near sunset, Titan had stopped near a crushed nursery. He hadn't barked. He had sat down just like he was sitting now. He had tilted his head back, and he had made this exact sound, this mournful threnody that echoed through the ruins. It was the signal for a recovery, not a rescue. It was the signal Titan gave when the heart he was listening for had stopped beating. Jack felt a wave of nausea crash over him. The room seemed to tilt. Titan wasn't signaling for a rescue anymore. He was mourning. "He thinks it's dead," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the dog's song. "What did you say?" Miller asked, stepping closer. Jack turned to the captain, his eyes wide and haunted. "He thinks whatever is in that box just died. That is his death howl, Captain. He only does that when he finds a body." Julian laughed. It was a brittle, forced sound. "A body! You are insane. It is a heart. It is an organ. It is dead tissue kept alive by machines. Of course, it smells dead to a dog." "No," Jack said, shaking his head violently. "No. He knows the difference. He knows the difference between tissue and a person. He smells a person, Julian, and he thinks they are gone." Titan's howl tapered off into a series of broken, sobbing whimpers. He laid his head on his front paws, his eyes fixed on the silver case. He looked defeated. Jack felt a cold rage ignite in his chest, replacing the fear. If Titan was right, they were too late. But if Titan was confused, it meant the signal was fading. It meant life was slipping away right now. "Open it," Jack said. His voice was no longer pleading. It was dead. "Open it, or I will break your fingers one by one until you give me the code." Julian backed into the table, knocking the suitcase slightly. It slid an inch. "You are threatening a diplomat. I am threatening a murderer," Jack said, stepping forward. Miller put a hand on Jack's chest, stopping him. "Enough, Reynolds. We are waiting for the X-ray. It will be here in 2 minutes. 2 minutes is too long," Jack screamed, pointing at the dog. "Look at him. He's giving up." Titan let out one last long sigh. His tail gave a weak thump against the floor. He closed his eyes. The silence that followed was worse than the howling. It was heavy and final. It felt like a tomb. Julian looked at his watch again. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't read the dial. He looked at the suitcase, then at the door, then at Miller. He was calculating. He was looking for an exit. Miller saw it. He saw the shift in Julian's demeanor. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the skittish energy of a trapped animal. Miller looked at the dog slumped in the corner. Then he looked at the suitcase. He reached for his radio. "EOD, where is that scanner? We are at the door." "Captain?" The radio crackled. "Let them in," Miller said, stepping back. The door beeped and unlocked. 2 technicians rolled a large gray machine into the room. They looked nervous, eyeing the dog in the corner and the tension in the air. "Scan it," Miller ordered, pointing to the table. "Right now." Julian stepped forward, blocking the machine. "You cannot X-ray this. The radiation will destroy the cells. The heart will be useless. You will be liable for millions. Move or be moved." Miller set his hand resting on his baton. Julian hesitated. He looked at Jack, who was staring at the suitcase with the intensity of a man watching a ticking bomb. Julian stepped aside, his face a mask of hatred. "Do it!" he spat. "And when you find nothing, I will own you." The technician positioned the scanner over the suitcase. The machine hummed to life. A green laser grid projected over the silver metal. Jack held his breath. Titan lifted his head, his ears swiveling toward the hum of the machine. The technician stared at the monitor. He frowned. He adjusted a dial. He frowned again. "What is it?" Miller asked. "I'm getting nothing." "Captain," the technician said, tapping the screen. "It's just black." "What do you mean black?" Jack asked. "I mean the density is off the charts," the technician explained. "This case isn't just aluminum. It's lined with lead. Thick lead, probably a 1/4 inch. The X-rays can't penetrate it. It's a black box." Julian smiled. It was a thin, victorious smile. "I told you. Anti-radiation shielding, standard protocol for high-value organ transport. Now are we finished?" Jack looked at the black screen. Lead. Lead blocked radiation. Lead blocked X-rays. But lead didn't block sound. and lead didn't block smell if there was a vent. Titan stood up. He didn't howl. He didn't bark. He stared at the case and he sneezed. Then he whined a sharp, inquisitive sound. His tail gave a tiny, hopeful wag. Jack saw it. The shift. Titan wasn't mourning anymore. He was listening again. He hears it. Jack whispered. He hears it. What Miller asked. Whatever is inside, Jack said. It's not dead. Not yet. Titan just heard it move. Jack looked at the lock. He looked at the useless X-ray machine. He looked at Julian's sweating face. He knew there were no more options. No more waiting for permission. He didn't grab the baton. He grabbed the fire axe mounted on the wall next to the door. Reynolds, no Miller, shouted. Jack swung. The heavy steel door of the interrogation room hissed open, breaking the suffocating atmosphere of Titan's grief. Two technicians from the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit pushed a large cart into the room, their faces obscured by protective visors. They moved with the sterile efficiency of men who spent their lives dismantling death. The equipment was heavy and industrial, a portable X-ray generator and a flat panel detector designed to see through steel and concrete. Captain Miller stepped back, gesturing to the table. The room was small, and the arrival of the bomb squad made it feel like a coffin. The air grew hot and stagnant. Jack stood by the wall, his hand resting on Titan's head, feeling the tremors still running through the dog's body. Titan had stopped howling, but his eyes were fixed on the new machine, watching it with a deep mistrust. Scan it, Miller ordered, his voice tight. I want to know exactly what is inside that shell. The lead technician positioned the generator over the silver suitcase. He adjusted the angle, aiming the emitter directly at the center of the case. A green laser grid appeared, projecting a crosshair onto the brushed metal surface. The hum of the machine, rising in pitch, sounded like a dentist's drill. Julian Thorne did not flinch. He stood with his back to the two-way mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. He watched the preparations with a look of bored detachment, as if he were waiting for a valet to bring his car rather than watching a bomb squad investigate his luggage. Do be careful, he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. That casing is a prototype alloy. It costs more than your entire annual budget. If you scratch it, you bought it. Jack ignored him. He kept his eyes on the monitor screen held by the second technician. This was it. The moment of truth. X-rays didn't lie. They would strip away the metal and the plastic and reveal the secrets hidden inside. If it was a heart, they would see the organic mass floating in fluid. If it was a bomb, they would see the wires and the detonator. If it was drugs, they would see the dense organic bricks. Initializing scan, the technician announced. The room went silent. The machine clicked a rapid staccato sound as it fired high-energy photons through the target. On the handheld monitor, a loading bar filled up green. Image processing. Jack held his breath. He prayed to see something, anything that would vindicate his dog. He prayed for wires. He prayed for cocaine. He prayed for anything other than a human heart. The image appeared on the screen. The technician frowned. He tapped the screen with a gloved finger. He adjusted the contrast. He adjusted the brightness. Then he looked up at Captain Miller, his expression baffled. Captain, I'm getting a 0 read. What does that mean? Miller asked, stepping closer to look at the screen. It means the image is black, the technician said, turning the monitor so they could see. Jack stared at the screen. It was a solid rectangular void. No outlines, no shapes, just a dense, impenetrable block of shadow. The X-rays hadn't passed through. They had been absorbed completely. It's shielded, the technician said, his voice rising in surprise. I've scanned bank vaults that were more transparent than this. This isn't just aluminum or steel. It's lined with lead. Thick lead. At least a quarter-inch, maybe more. Miller turned to Julian. Why is your medical case lined with lead, Dr. Thorne? Julian sighed, rolling his eyes as if explaining simple addition to a slow child. Because Captain, organs for transplant are extremely sensitive to cellular degradation caused by cosmic radiation at high altitudes. When we fly at 30,000 feet, the radiation levels are significantly higher. This unit is designed to protect the tissue integrity of a pediatric heart. It is standard protocol for high-value organ transport. He smiled, a thin, tight expression that didn't reach his eyes. It's called doing the job properly. Perhaps you should try it. Jack felt a cold stone settle in his gut. It was a perfect excuse. It was scientifically plausible and legally sound. The lead lining wasn't there to keep radiation out. It was there to keep prying eyes out. It was a black box designed to move through the world unseen. "So you can't see inside," Miller asked the technician. "Not with this," the technician admitted. "We would need a neutron scanner or an industrial gamma ray source. We don't have that here." Miller ran a hand over his face. He looked at the suitcase, which sat there, innocent and impenetrable. He looked at Titan, who was now pressing his nose into the crack beneath the door, trying to smell fresh air, trying to escape the smell of the room. "Run the trace detectors," Miller commanded. "If we can't see in, we smell in. Swab the seams, swab the handle, swab the lock. If there are explosives or narcotics inside, there will be microscopic residue on the outside." The second technician pulled out a wand-like device, an explosive trace detector. He pulled a fresh sample trap, a small white disc of Teflon-coated fabric, and began to wipe the suitcase. He was thorough. He wiped the heavy latches. He wiped the digital keypad that Jack had threatened to smash. He ran the cloth along the rubber seal that separated the lid from the body. Every movement was agonizingly slow. The sound of the fabric rasping against the metal was the only noise in the room. Titan lifted his head, watching the wand. He gave a low huff of air, a sound of dismissal. He knew the machine was useless. He knew it because he was the superior machine. The technician inserted the sample trap into the analyzer, the device whirred, heating the sample to vaporize the particles. The screen flashed, analyzing. Jack watched the progress bar. "Please," he thought, "just a trace. A molecule of plastic explosive. A speck of heroin. Anything to keep that box in this room." The machine beeped. A cheerful green light flashed. No alarm. The technician looked at the screen and shook his head. "Clean, Captain. No nitrates. No glycerin. No opioids. No amphetamines. It's sterile." He ran a second test just to be sure, swabbing the handle where Julian's hand had been. The result was the same. Negative. 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 The science had spoken. The technology that cost millions of dollars and was operated by trained specialists had rendered its verdict. The suitcase was safe. It was just a box. Julian Thorne stepped away from the wall. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric where Titan had grabbed him earlier. He walked over to the table and placed his hand on the suitcase, reclaiming it. "Are we finished?" he asked. His voice was quiet, deadly calm. "You have assaulted me. You have illegally detained me. You have x-rayed a medical device against protocol. You have swabbed my personal property. And you have found nothing. Absolutely nothing." He looked at Jack, his eyes dark and empty. "You have allowed the fantasies of a senile dog to dictate a federal investigation. And now I am going to walk out of this room. I am going to get on my plane. And when I land, I am going to call the Attorney General. And by tomorrow morning, neither of you will have a job." Captain Miller stood frozen. He looked at the black screen of the X-ray. He looked at the green light of the trace detector. He looked at the badge Jack had thrown on the floor. The evidence was overwhelming. They were wrong. They had made a massive, catastrophic mistake. "Unlock the door," Miller said, his voice hollow. Captain Jack said, taking a step forward. "Unlock the door," Reynolds, Miller shouted, spinning on him. "It's over. We missed. Or we were wrong. It doesn't matter anymore. We have no probable cause. We have nothing." Jack felt the room spinning. He looked at the suitcase. It sat there, gleaming and silent. It was a fortress. It had beaten them. The lead had blocked the eyes. The seal had blocked the nose. The perfect cover story had blocked the mind. But Titan wasn't looking at the machines. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at the suitcase. And he wasn't growling. He wasn't howling. He was listening. The dog's head was cocked to the side, his large ears swiveling like satellite dishes, adjusting to a frequency no human could hear. His body was still trembling, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was concentration. Intense, singular concentration. Julian grabbed the handle of the suitcase. "I am leaving." He pulled the case off the table. The wheels hit the floor with a heavy thud. Thud. Titan's head snapped up. He let out a sharp, inquisitive yip. He stood up, the chain on his collar rattling. He took a step toward the suitcase, his tail giving a single hesitant wag. Jack saw it. He saw the shift. The machine said nothing. The chemical sniffer said nothing. But Titan said something. Wait, Jack whispered. Julian ignored him, pulling the suitcase toward the door. Get out of my way. Titan didn't attack. He didn't lunge. He simply sat down. He sat down directly in Julian's path, blocking the door. He looked at the suitcase. He tilted his head again, and then in the silence of the room, everyone heard it. It wasn't a tick. It wasn't a hum. It was a rhythmic mechanical sound coming from inside the case. Hiss, click, hiss, click. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. That's the cooling unit, Julian said quickly, his voice rising in pitch. It's the pump for the preservation fluid. But Titan didn't care about the hiss. He cared about what was underneath it. He crawled forward on his belly, ignoring Jack's command to stay. He pressed his ear against the metal shell of the suitcase, and then he barked. Not the bark of aggression, not the bark of discovery. It was a soft, rhythmic bark. 3 short barks. A pause. 1 long bark. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He knew that cadence. He hadn't heard it in years, not since the training days in the ruins of the old firehouse. That's not a drug alert, Jack said, his voice trembling. And that's not a bomb alert. He looked at Miller, tears standing in his eyes. That is the heartbeat signal, Captain. He hears a heartbeat, and it's not coming from a pump. Julian kicked at the dog. Move, you stupid animal. Titan didn't move. He took the kick. He barked again. 3 short, 1 long. Alive. 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 Here. Jack looked at the X-ray machine that saw nothing. He looked at the trace detector that smelled nothing. And he realized that they had been using the wrong tools all along. You don't find a soul with a laser. You find it with a soul. Jack reached out and grabbed the handle of the fire axe mounted on the wall. The red paint was cool under his hand. Reynolds, don't, Miller warned, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at the dog, too. I'm not letting him leave, Jack said. He hefted the axe. The weight was comforting. It was primitive. It was brutal. It was the only key they had left. The room felt heavy with the weight of failure. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to mock the silence of the 3 men standing around the stainless steel table. The X-ray machine sat dark and useless, its screen a blank testament to the perfection of Julian Thorne's deception. The chemical swab wand lay on the counter, its green light still blinking a cheerful and infuriating negative. Science had spoken, technology had rendered its verdict, and the verdict was that Officer Jack Reynolds and his dog were wrong. Julian Thorne adjusted his silk tie with a sharp snap of his wrists. The fear that had briefly haunted his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, polished arrogance. He looked at the shattered lock on the door where Jack had threatened to break through. He looked at the taser still in Jack's hand, though it was lowered now, pointed harmlessly at the floor. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who knows the trap has failed. I believe we are done here, Captain, Julian said, his voice smooth and commanding. You have wasted 20 minutes of my time. You have endangered a critical medical timeline, and you have assaulted a diplomatic courier. My lawyers will be in touch with your department before my plane even touches down in New York. Captain Miller did not look at him. He was looking at Jack. His face was gray and lined with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had just watched a friend jump off a cliff and had been unable to stop him. Put the taser away, Reynolds Miller said softly. It's over. We missed. Jack felt a numbness spreading through his limbs. It was the cold paralysis of total defeat. He looked at his badge lying on the floor, the silver star dull under the harsh lights. He looked at the suitcase that sat there like a monolith, impenetrable and silent. And he looked at Titan. The dog was still sitting in the corner where he had been chained. The fight seemed to have drained out of him. His head hung low, his ears flattened against his skull. He was panting short, shallow breaths, his tongue lolling out the side of his mouth. He looked old. For the first time in 6 years, Jack saw the gray in Titan's muzzle, not as a mark of wisdom, but as a mark of age and weakness. They were both done. Washed up, broken. I am taking my property, Julian announced. He stepped forward and grabbed the handle of the silver suitcase. He pulled it off the table. The heavy rubber wheels hit the floor with a dull thud. Thud. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. And in the corner, Titan's head snapped up. It wasn't a slow movement. It was instantaneous. The dog's ears pricked forward, swiveling like radar dishes. His mouth closed, cutting off the panting. He held his breath. His amber eyes, which had been dull with misery, suddenly burned with a laser-like focus. He wasn't looking at Julian. He wasn't looking at Jack. He was looking at the box. "Wait," Jack whispered. Julian ignored him. He began to pull the suitcase toward the door, the wheels rumbling over the tile. "Get out of my way," he sneered. Titan stood up. The chain on his collar rattled against the wall, but he didn't lunge. He didn't growl. The feral aggression that had terrified the terminal just minutes ago was gone. In its place was something else, something eerie. Titan walked to the end of his chain and stood perfectly still. His body was rigid, trembling not with rage, but with an intense, concentrated effort. He cocked his head to the side, and then he spoke. It wasn't a bark, at least not the kind of bark people associated with a police dog. It wasn't the deep, guttural roar of a German shepherd warning off a threat. It was a high, sharp sound. Precise, rhythmic, woof, woof, woof. 3 short, sharp barks, staccato, like gunfire. Then silence. Titan weighted his head, tilted his ears, twitching as if trying to catch a whisper in a hurricane. Woof. One long, drawn-out howl that started low and rose to a piercing crescendo before cutting off abruptly. Jack felt the blood freeze in his veins. The hairs on his arms stood up. He knew that sound. He hadn't heard it in 4 years, not since the training exercises in the ruins of the old demolished firehouse on the edge of the city. He hadn't heard it since the week they spent digging through the mudslide in California. Titan barked again. Woof, woof, woof. Silence. The room held its breath. Julian stopped walking. He looked at the dog with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. Woof. Jack dropped the taser. It clattered to the floor, echoing the shock that was hammering in his chest. He turned to Miller, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Captain," he whispered, "do you know what that is?" Miller shook his head, his hand resting nervously on his belt. "It sounds like he's broken Reynolds. He's just making noise." "No," Jack said, his voice rising, shaking with the force of his realization. "No, he is not making noise. That is not a random bark. That is a code," Julian scoffed. "A code? The dog is speaking in Morse code now. This is pathetic. Move aside." He pulled the suitcase again. Titan threw himself against the chain, but he didn't snap. He didn't snarl. He kept barking. The rhythm was perfect, unwavering, mechanical in its precision. 3 short, 1 long. 3 short, 1 long. "That is the live fine signal," Jack said, pointing a trembling finger at the dog. Miller frowned. "The what?" "The live fine signal," Jack shouted. "Before he was a drug dog, Titan was Urban Search and Rescue, USR. We trained for building collapses, earthquakes, bombings. He was trained to find people buried under tons of concrete and steel." Jack stepped closer to the captain, his eyes pleading, his voice urgent. "When a search dog finds a dead body, they whine. They act depressed. They give the cadaver alert. That's what he was doing before. That's why he was howling. He thought whatever was in there was gone." Titan barked again. 3 short, 1 long. The sound was demanding. It cut through the skepticism. It cut through the lies. "But this," Jack said, gesturing to the rhythmic barking, "this is the live find. He uses this when he hears a heartbeat, when he hears breathing, when he senses movement that is purposeful. He is telling us there is a survivor." "A survivor," Miller repeated, looking at the silver case. "In a box that size. Reynolds, that's impossible. It's a medical transport. It's a heart. A heart doesn't breathe." Jack spun around to face Julian. The courier was standing still now, his hand white-knuckled on the handle of the suitcase. The sweat on his forehead was no longer just a sheen, it was dripping down his temples. His eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a weapon, looking for anything but the dog. "A heart doesn't trigger a live find," Jack said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "A heart doesn't have a rhythm that a dog can hear through lead. A heart doesn't shift its weight." Titan barked again, louder, more urgent. The pauses between the sequences were getting shorter. He was getting desperate. He was trying to tell them that the clock was running out. Jack looked at the suitcase. It was big, big enough for a cooler, big enough for a machine, big enough for something else. He walked toward Julian. "Stay back," Julian warned, backing up until he hit the wall. "You have no probable cause. Your machines cleared me." "My machines are blind," Jack said. My dog is not. He stopped 3 feet from the courier. He could smell the man's fear. It smelled like sour milk and expensive cologne. Titan thinks there is a person in that box, Jack said. Not a part of a person. A whole person. A living, breathing person. Julian laughed, but it came out as a high-pitched squeak. That is absurd. It is a suitcase. A person would not fit. Jack looked at the size of the case. It was a large checked bag size, 30 inches high, 20 inches wide, deep, reinforced. A grown man wouldn't fit, Jack agreed, but a child would. The words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. A child. Miller stepped forward, his face hardening. Reynolds, do not say that unless you are sure. I am sure, Jack said, not taking his eyes off Julian. Titan is sure. And look at him, Captain. Look at the courier. He isn't worried about his schedule anymore. He's terrified. Julian dropped the handle. I am done listening to this insanity. I am leaving. If you want to stop me, you will have to shoot me. He moved toward the door, leaving the suitcase standing alone in the middle of the room. Titan stopped barking. He watched Julian walk away from the bag. The dog tilted his head. He looked at the bag, then at the retreating man. He seemed to understand that the threat was leaving, but the prize was staying. Then Titan did something that broke Jack's heart. The dog lay down. He belly crawled across the floor, the chain dragging behind him until he was as close to the suitcase as the tether would allow. He stretched his neck out, straining every muscle. He pressed his wet nose against the cold metal of the suitcase wheel. He closed his eyes, and he let out a soft, gentle whimper. It was a sound of comfort. It was the sound a mother dog makes to her pups. It was a sound that said, I am here. You are not alone. Jack felt tears prick his eyes. The aggression was gone. The code was gone. Now there was only compassion. He hears it, Jack whispered. He hears the baby. Miller looked at the dog lying prone on the floor, pouring his heart into a metal box. He looked at Julian, who had stopped at the door, his hand on the knob, his body rigid. Stop him, Miller said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of the badge. Julian froze. Open the bag, Miller ordered. Julian turned around. His face was twisted into a mask of pure hatred. You have no right. I have probable cause, Miller said, his voice gaining strength. My officer has articulated a reasonable suspicion based on the behavior of a certified police K-9. That signal is documented. That signal is evidence. Open the bag, Dr. Thorne, or we will open it for you, and we will not be gentle. I lost the key. Julian lied, his voice shaking. The keypad is jammed. It won't open. Jack stepped up to the table. He looked at the heavy industrial latches. He looked at the digital lock that glowed with a mocking red light. We don't need a key, Jack said. He walked to the wall where the emergency fire axe hung inside a glass case. He didn't bother with the little hammer. He punched the glass. It shattered, raining shards onto the floor. He didn't feel the cuts on his knuckles. He grabbed the heavy red handle of the axe. He turned back to the room. He looked like a demon. He looked like an angel. Get the dog back, Miller shouted, moving to shield Titan. Jack walked to the suitcase. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't look at Miller. He looked at the silver shell that was hiding the truth. Titan lifted his head. He didn't flinch at the sight of the axe. He thumped his tail once. 3 short thumps, 1 long. Jack raised the axe over his head. One chance, Julian, Jack said, his voice calm and terrible. Give me the code, or I turn this $1 million box into scrap metal. Julian stared at the axe. He stared at Jack's eyes, and he saw that there was no bluff. There was no hesitation. He saw a man who was willing to destroy everything to save what was inside. Julian broke. He didn't speak. He just slumped against the door, sliding down to the floor, his face buried in his hands. He didn't give the code. Jack didn't wait. He brought the axe down. The heavy fire axe remained suspended in the air, a breathless inch of steel hovering above the silver casing. Jack's muscles were locked tight, trembling with the effort of holding back the strike. His eyes were fixed on Julian Thorne, who had slumped against the wall, his face buried in his hands. The silence in the interrogation room was so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. Then the electronic lock of the room's main door buzzed. Jack didn't lower the axe. He didn't look away from the suitcase. He knew that if he broke eye contact with the objective, he might lose the nerve to finish what he had started. The door swung open and a woman rushed in. She wasn't police. She wasn't security. She was wearing blue scrubs and a white coat, the universal uniform of someone who saves lives, not takes them. It was Dr. Elena Vance, the airport's chief medical liaison. She had been summoned 20 minutes ago when the words human heart were first screamed in the terminal. She carried a specialized thermal transport bag, and her face was flushed with the urgency of her mission. "What is going on in here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the testosterone and fear in the room. "Why is the courier on the floor? Why is there an axe?" Captain Miller stepped forward, placing a hand on the doctor's arm to steady her. "Doctor, we have a situation. We believe the cargo might be compromised." "Compromised," she snapped, stepping past him toward the table. "If you have kept a donor organ waiting for this long, you haven't just compromised it, you have murdered it. Do you have any idea how fragile cardiac tissue is?" She reached the table and glared at Jack. "Put that axe down, officer. You look like a maniac." Jack slowly lowered the axe. He didn't drop it. He just rested the head on the table, keeping the handle within easy reach. He looked at the doctor. Her anger was righteous. She believed the lie just like everyone else. "Check it," Jack said, his voice raspy. "Just check it." Dr. Vance scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief at the police incompetence. She turned her attention to the silver suitcase. She moved with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a digital diagnostic tool meant to interface with medical transport units. "I need to check the internal environment," she narrated, more to herself than to the men in the room. "If the temperature has fluctuated by even 2 degrees, we have to declare the organ non-viable." She ran her hand along the side of the case, searching for the external display panel. She found it hidden under a sleek magnetic flap near the handle. She flipped the cover open. Julian Thorne, who had been silent, suddenly scrambled to his feet. "Don't touch that!" he shouted, lunging from the wall. "You will disrupt the calibration." Miller blocked him with a stiff arm to the chest, shoving him back. "Stay down!" Dr. Vance ignored the shouting. She pressed the button to wake up the display. The small LCD screen flickered to life. Usually these screens glowed with a cool, reassuring blue light indicating that the cryogenic stasis was holding. But this screen didn't glow blue. It glowed a harsh, angry red. Dr. Vance froze. Her fingers hovered over the glass. She blinked once, then twice, as if she couldn't believe the data her eyes were sending to her brain. She leaned closer, squinting at the numbers. "This is impossible," she whispered. "What is it?" Miller asked, stepping up behind her. "Is it spoiled? Is it too cold?" "It's not cold at all," she said, her voice losing its professional edge and trembling with confusion. "It's hot." She tapped the screen, trying to reset the sensor. The numbers didn't change. They pulsed steadily. 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. She turned to look at Julian Thorne. Her face wasn't angry anymore. It was horrified. "This unit isn't cooling," she said, slowly articulating every syllable. "It's heating, or rather, it is maintaining heat." Jack felt a jolt of electricity shoot down his spine. The number echoed in his head. 37 degrees. He knew that number. Every first responder knew that number. It wasn't the temperature of a cooler. It wasn't the temperature of a dead organ on ice. "That's body temperature," Jack said, the realization crashing over him like a wave. Dr. Vance looked at Jack, then back at the case. "Yes, that is exactly human body temperature. If there was a heart in there sitting in preservation fluid at this temperature, it would have decomposed hours ago. It would be soup." She looked at the display again. "But the humidity sensors are active. The oxygen exchange rate is cycling." She backed away from the table, her hands raising to her mouth. "That's not a storage unit," she whispered. "That's an incubator." The word hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Incubator. Titan, who had been lying quietly, suddenly sat up. He didn't bark. He just watched the doctor, his amber eyes burning. He knew. He had known since the beginning. He hadn't been smelling death. He hadn't been smelling a heart. He had been smelling the warmth of a living being. Julian Thorne let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "The machine is broken," he yelled, his composure shattering completely. The cooling compressor failed. "It's running in reverse. The heat from the battery is venting into the chamber. It's cooking the heart." He threw himself at the table, his hands clawing for the suitcase. "I have to get it to the plane," he shrieked, spittle flying from his mouth. I have to plug it into the onboard power supply to reset the cycle. Let me go. You are destroying it. It was a desperate lie, a frantic improvisation, but it was too late. The pieces had fallen into place. Jack stepped in front of Julian, blocking him from the case. He looked into the man's eyes. He saw the sweat pouring down Julian's face, soaking his collar. It wasn't the sweat of a man worried about a machine. It was the cold, clammy sweat of a monster who had been unmasked. It's not broken, is it? Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. It's working perfectly. It's keeping something warm. Julian swung a wild haymaker punch at Jack's head. It was a clumsy blow born of panic. Jack ducked easily and drove his shoulder into Julian's chest, slamming him back against the wall. Titan didn't wait. The moment Julian attacked, the dog launched himself. The chain snapped tight, but Titan was close enough. He snapped his jaws, clamping onto the fabric of Julian's pants, dragging him down to the floor. "Get him off me!" Julian screamed, kicking at the dog. Miller finally moved. He grabbed Julian's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him face down onto the linoleum. "Stay down!" he roared. Jack didn't watch the arrest. He turned back to the suitcase. He looked at Dr. Vance. "Open it," he said. "I don't have the code," she stammered, staring at the red numbers. Jack grabbed the fire axe again. The weight of it felt different now. It didn't feel like a weapon of destruction. It felt like a key. "Step back," he told the doctor. Dr. Vance scrambled away, pressing herself into the corner. Jack looked at the lock. He looked at the heavy industrial hinges. He took a breath, steadying his hands. Titan released Julian's leg and trotted over to Jack. The dog sat down next to the table. He looked up at the axe, then at the box. He gave a single soft woof. "Do it!" Jack swung the axe. The blade whistled through the air. It struck the locking mechanism with a deafening screech of tearing metal. Sparks showered onto the table. The plastic keypad shattered, sending shards flying across the room. Jack didn't stop. He swung again, and again. The metal groaned and twisted. The heavy security latches bent under the assault. With a final grunt of exertion, Jack wedged the blade of the axe under the lid and pulled. The metal shrieked in protest. The seal popped with a hiss of escaping air. Jack dropped the axe. He grabbed the lid with his bare hands, ignoring the jagged metal that cut into his palms. He heaved it open. The contents of the suitcase were revealed. Jack froze. Dr. Vance gasped. Captain Miller looked up from the floor, his eyes widening in shock. Inside the case, nestled in a bed of high-tech foam and surrounded by blinking lights and oxygen tubes, was not a heart. It was a baby. A tiny, perfect human baby boy. He was pale, his skin possessing a bluish tint. He was wearing a small diaper and nothing else. His chest was barely moving, rising and falling in shallow, terrified gasps. His eyes were closed. He was asleep or drugged into unconsciousness. Titan stood up on his hind legs, placing his front paws gently on the edge of the table. He stretched his neck out and sniffed the baby's face. He let out a low, mournful whine and licked the infant's cheek. The baby didn't move. "Oh my God!" Dr. Vance whispered, rushing forward. She pushed Jack aside and placed her hands on the baby. Her fingers flew, checking a pulse, lifting an eyelid. "He's sedated," she said, her voice shaking. "Heavily sedated. And he's hypoxic. The air scrubber in this thing must have failed when it was dropped. He's running out of air." She looked at Jack, her eyes filled with tears. "Get the oxygen now!" Jack scrambled for the wall unit, grabbing the mask and the tank. He handed it to her. She placed the mask over the tiny face. "Breathe, little one," she whispered. "Breathe." The room was silent, save for the hiss of the oxygen and the frantic beating of Jack's own heart. He looked at Titan. The dog had dropped back to all fours. He wasn't barking. He wasn't howling. He was sitting right next to the doctor, his nose touching her elbow, watching the baby with an intensity that burned. Julian Thorne lay on the floor, his face pressed against the tile. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was sobbing quietly, a defeated, broken sound. Jack looked at the man. "You monster," he whispered. Then a sound cut through the room, a sound sweeter than any symphony. A cough. The baby's chest hitched. He coughed again, a weak, sputtering sound. Then he took a deep, ragged breath, and then he cried. It was a thin, reedy wail, but it was loud. It was the sound of life returning. Titan's tail started to wag. Thump, thump, thump. He let out a happy yip and licked Jack's hand. Jack fell back against the wall, his legs giving out. He slid down to the floor, burying his face in his hands. He laughed. It was a shaky, hysterical laugh mixed with sobs. He was right, Jack said, choking on the words. He was right the whole time. Captain Miller stood up, dragging Julian with him. He looked at the baby crying in the doctor's arms. He looked at the broken suitcase, and he looked at Titan. He walked over to the dog. He knelt down, ignoring the blood on the floor and the chaos in the room. He reached out and took Titan's paw in his hand. "I'm sorry," Miller whispered to the dog. "I'm so sorry." Titan didn't hold a grudge. He licked the captain's face, his tail still thumping a steady rhythm against the floor. He had done his job. He had held the line, and now the pack was safe. Jack stood poised with the fire axe raised high above his head, his muscles trembling with the strain of the imminent strike, but before he could bring the heavy blade crashing down, a sudden explosion of movement shattered the standoff. Titan, who had been watching Jack with an intensity that burned like a fever, finally reached his breaking point. The dog had sensed the shift in the room the moment Jack grabbed the weapon. He understood that the time for waiting was over. He understood that the barrier was about to fall, and he could not wait another second. With a roar that sounded more like a lion than a canine, Titan threw his entire 80-pound body against the restraint. The steel clip on his tactical collar, which had held firm against criminals and crowd control lines, finally met a force it could not withstand. The metal snapped with a sharp ping that ricocheted off the walls. Titan was free. He didn't attack Julian. He didn't attack Miller. He launched himself at the table, landing with a heavy thud right next to the silver suitcase. His paws scrabbled for purchase on the slick stainless steel. He lowered his head and began to dig. It was a frantic, violent motion. Titan wasn't digging at dirt or rubble. He was digging at hardened aerospace-grade aluminum. His claws raked across the metal, screeching like nails on a chalkboard, a sound so piercing it made Dr. Vance cover her ears. Titan didn't care. He dug harder. His back arched, his legs pumping like pistons. Jack lowered the axe slowly, his eyes wide. He saw the first streak of red appear on the silver case. Then another. Titan was digging so hard that his nails were splitting. Blood began to smear across the pristine surface of the suitcase, splattering onto the white tile floor below. "Titan, stop!" Jack whispered, horrified by the self-destruction. But Titan couldn't stop. The signal he was receiving from inside that box was fading. The heartbeat was erratic. The breathing was shallow. To the dog, the metal shell wasn't valuable property. It was debris. It was a collapsed wall. And behind that wall, a life was flickering out. He stopped scratching for a fraction of a second, realizing the metal was impenetrable. He shifted his tactics instantly. His head snapped down to the side of the suitcase where the two halves of the shell met. He found the thick black rubber gasket that created the hermetic seal. He tilted his head sideways, opening his jaws to their limit. He bit down. Julian Thorne screamed from the floor. "He's breaching the seal. He's killing it." Titan's teeth sank into the heavy industrial rubber. He growled a low, muffled sound that vibrated through the table. He jerked his head back violently, trying to tear the strip away. The suitcase slid across the table, screeching against the metal. Jack stepped forward and braced the case with his hip, holding it steady for the dog. "Good boy," Jack breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Get it." Titan shook his head again. The rubber stretched. It groaned. And then with a wet, tearing sound, a chunk of the seal ripped free. Immediately, a sound filled the room. Hiss. It was the sound of pressure equalizing, the sound of the vacuum seal failing. A plume of white vapor shot out from the gap where the rubber had been torn. It hissed into the sterile air of the interrogation room, curling like smoke. It was supposed to be nitrogen. It was supposed to be the inert gas used to preserve organs. It should have been odorless. It should have been cold enough to burn. But Titan didn't recoil. He didn't pull back from the freezing gas. Instead, he pushed his nose right into the jet of vapor. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring wide to capture every molecule of the escaping air. He closed his eyes. His body, which had been vibrating with adrenaline, suddenly went still. He let out a soft, whimpering sigh. He licked the metal where the gas was condensing into water droplets. He licked it tenderly, almost reverently. Jack dropped the axe. It clattered to the floor, forgotten. He fell to his knees beside the table, bringing his face level with the dog's. He needed to know. He needed to verify what his partner was telling him. Jack leaned in close to the tear in the seal. He closed his eyes and inhaled. He expected the sharp chemical sting of preservation fluid. He expected the metallic tang of blood or the sterile scent of medical-grade plastic. He smelled none of those things. The scent that hit him was faint, carried on the escaping cold air, but it was unmistakable. It was a smell that triggered a primal memory in the deepest part of his brain. It was a smell that belonged in a nursery, not an airport interrogation room. It was warm. It was sweet. It smelled like heated milk and talcum powder. It smelled like formula. It smelled like a bee. Jack's eyes snapped open. He looked at Captain Miller, who was standing frozen, his hand halfway to his holster. He looked at Dr. Vance, who was staring at the vapor with confusion. "That's not a heart," Jack said, his voice trembling so hard he could barely form the words. "What is it?" Miller asked, stepping closer, the color draining from his face. "Is it explosives? Is it chemicals?" Jack shook his head. He looked at Titan, who was now resting his chin on the suitcase, his eyes soft and watery, blinking slowly as he breathed in the scent of the child he had fought to save. "It's milk," Jack whispered. "It smells like warm milk and baby powder." Julian Thorne let out a strangled sob. He tried to scramble to his feet, to run, to fight, to do something, but his legs wouldn't work. He collapsed back against the wall, pulling his knees to his chest. Dr. Vance rushed forward, pushing past Miller. She leaned down and sniffed the escaping gas. Her eyes widened. She looked at the temperature gauge, which was still flashing red. She looked at the vapor, which wasn't freezing fog, but humidity. "Oh God," she breathed. "It's humidified oxygen. That's why it smells sweet. It's an incubation mix." She turned to Jack, terror and realization warring in her features. "Break it!" she screamed. "Break it open now!" Jack didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the lid of the suitcase with both hands. His fingers found the gap Titan had created. The metal bit into his skin, but he didn't feel it. He braced his foot against the table leg. He looked at Titan. Together, Jack grunted. Titan bit down on the rubber again. Jack pulled on the metal. Man and dog worked in perfect unison, driven by some desperate need. With a screech of tortured aluminum, the latches gave way. The lock shattered. The lid flew back, crashing against the table. The contents of the suitcase were revealed to the world, and the world stopped turning. There was no ice. There was no plastic bag filled with saline. Instead, the interior of the suitcase was lined with soft acoustic foam. Embedded in the foam were blinking LED lights, a small oxygen tank, and a silent battery pack. And in the center, nestled in a custom-molded cradle, was a bundle wrapped in a thermal blanket. A tiny hand slipped out from under the blanket. The fingers were blue. Titan stopped panting. He stood on his hind legs, resting his paws on the edge of the open case. He reached in and gently, very gently licked the tiny blue hand. The baby didn't move. Silence. Absolute crushing silence. Then Jack moved. He reached into the box, his large, rough hands trembling as he touched the small chest. He felt for a rhythm. He felt for life. Under his fingertips, he felt a flutter. Weak. Erratic. Fading. But there. He's alive. Jack choked out, tears streaming down his face. He's alive. The room exploded into action, but for Jack, everything was in slow motion. He saw the doctor reaching for the child. He saw Miller shouting into his radio. He saw Julian curling into a ball on the floor, but mostly he saw Titan. The dog didn't bark in triumph. He didn't jump. He simply lowered his head, resting it on the edge of the suitcase right next to the baby he had claimed as his own. He watched with a quiet, vigilant love as the humans finally did their job. Titan's claws were bleeding onto the white floor. His breathing was ragged. He was exhausted. But he didn't look away. He had held the line. He had smelled the truth through the lead and the lies, and he had refused to let go. The first blow of the fire axe struck the suitcase with the violence of a thunderclap, echoing off the soundproofed walls like a gunshot inside a barrel. The blade bit deep into the reinforced aluminum shell, but it didn't break through. The metal groaned and warped, but the lock held fast. Jack didn't pause to breathe. He wrenched the axe free with a grunt of exertion and swung again. Sparks showered the table as steel met steel. The sheer force of the impact sent a tremor through Jack's arms, rattling his bones, but he felt no pain. He was running on pure adrenaline and a terrifying certainty that he was the only thing standing between a life and death. Captain Miller shouted something unintelligible, a roar of command that was lost in the cacophony of destruction. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for Jack's shoulder, intent on stopping the madness, but he never made contact. Julian Thorne moved first. The courier let out a feral scream of panic. He pushed himself off of the floor, his eyes wide with the realization that his carefully constructed facade was being hacked to pieces. He threw himself at Jack not with skill, but with the desperate flailing weight of a man who sees his own destruction. "Stop it! You are killing him!" Julian shrieked, grabbing at the handle of the axe. Jack stumbled, the heavy weapon swaying dangerously. For a split second, the two men grappled over the table, their faces inches apart. Jack saw the truth in Julian's eyes. It wasn't concern for a medical specimen. It was guilt. It was the terror of a man who knows the darkness is coming for him. "Get back!" Jack roared, shoving Julian away. Julian stumbled, but lunged again, reaching for the case, trying to pull it off the table, to crash it to the floor, to destroy the evidence before it could be revealed. But he forgot about the Guardian. Titan had been watching. The dog hadn't moved while Jack swung the axe, understanding instinctively that his handler needed space. But the moment Julian touched Jack, the moment the threat became physical, Titan exploded. He launched himself from under the table, a black and tan missile of righteous fury. He didn't bark. He simply collided with Julian in midair, his jaws clamping onto the padded shoulder of the expensive suit. The force of the impact drove Julian backward, slamming him into the floor with a bone-jarring thud. Titan didn't maul him. He didn't tear. He simply pinned him. He stood over the courier, his front paws pressing down on the man's chest, his teeth bared inches from Julian's throat. A low rumble vibrated in the dog's chest, a sound that promised absolute violence if the man moved even a single muscle. Julian froze, his hands raised in surrender, his breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Miller stopped. He looked at the dog holding the suspect hostage. He looked at Jack raising the axe for a third strike, and in that moment the captain made his choice. He stepped back. He lowered his hands. He let it happen. Jack swung the axe a third time. He didn't aim for the flat of the lid. He aimed for the seam where the digital lock fused the two halves together. The blade connected with a deafening screech of tearing metal. The lock disintegrated. Plastic and circuitry exploded outward. The tension in the pressurized seal released with a hiss that sounded like a dying breath. Jack dropped the axe. It clattered to the floor, ringing like a bell. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he reached for the lid. The metal was jagged and sharp where he had butchered it, but he grabbed it anyway, ignoring the bite of the aluminum into his palms. He looked at Dr. Vance. He looked at Miller, and then he heaved the lid open. The suitcase unfolded. For a second, there was no sound in the room, no breathing, no humming of lights. It was as if the universe had paused to look into that box. Jack looked down and his mind refused to process what he was seeing. He had expected a heart. He had expected drugs. He had even expected a bomb. He had not expected a machine. The interior of the suitcase was a marvel of terrifying engineering. It looked like the inside of a spacecraft. Banks of green and red LED lights blinked in a complex rhythm. Tubes of clear plastic snaked through it through a dense packing of black acoustic foam. A small silent fan spun in the corner next to a filtration unit that hummed with a barely audible vibration. A battery pack thick and heavy lined the bottom of the case. But in the center of this technological nest, carved out of the foam like a pearl in an oyster, was a capsule. It was a cylinder of thick, cloudy glass or plastic. Inside the capsule, bathed in the soft glow of the instrument panel, was a bundle wrapped in silver thermal blankets, and sticking out of the top of the bundle was a face. It was a baby, a human baby boy, no more than 3 or 4 months old. He was impossibly small. His skin was pale, possessing a terrible grayish-blue tint that spoke of oxygen deprivation. His eyes were closed. His tiny mouth was slightly open, and a clear plastic tube was taped to his cheek, feeding into his nose. He was perfectly still. Jack felt his knees give way. He gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. The horror of it washed over him in a cold tide. It wasn't a transplant organ. It was a whole child. A child packed like luggage. A child shipped like cargo. Dr. Vance let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She rushed forward, shoving Jack aside to get to the capsule. Her hands flew over the controls, checking the readings on the small digital displays embedded in the foam. "Oxygen levels critical," she whispered, her voice trembling with professional terror. "The scrubber unit. It's cracked." She pointed to a small plastic box near the baby's head. It had a hairline fracture running down the side, likely caused when Titan knocked Julian down in the terminal. The CO2 isn't venting, she said, looking at Jack with wide, panicked eyes. He is rebreathing his own carbon dioxide. He is suffocating. Titan, hearing the change in the humans' voices, left Julian on the floor. The courier didn't dare move. Titan trotted to the table and stood on his hind legs, placing his paws carefully on the edge, avoiding the sharp metal. He stretched his neck out and sniffed the baby. He whined, a high, thin sound of distress. He licked the glass capsule right over the baby's face. He knew Jack whispered. He heard the heart. Titan hadn't heard a pump. He hadn't heard a machine. He had heard the erratic, fluttering heartbeat of a dying child through layers of lead and foam. He had heard the struggle of a baby too sedated to cry, fighting for air in a dark metal box. Julian Thorne spoke from the floor, his voice a ragged whisper. He was an order. A special order. Jack turned to look at him. The rage that filled him was so pure it felt like white light. An order, Jack repeated. Julian didn't look at him. He looked at the ceiling. A private client in Zurich. They wanted a specific genetic profile. Healthy, male, Caucasian. We sedate them. We put them in the stasis units. They sleep for the flight. It's safe. It's usually safe. Jack walked over to him. He didn't hit him. He didn't have to. He looked down at the man who had turned a child into a commodity, and he saw nothing but a void. You put a baby in a box. Jack said, his voice dead. You put a living child in a suitcase and you checked him as luggage. Miller stepped in. He grabbed Julian by the collar and hauled him up, slamming him against the wall. He cuffed him, his movements rough and angry. You have the right to remain silent, Miller growled, and I suggest you use it because if you say one more word, I will forget I am a police officer. Dr. Vance screamed. He's not breathing. I can't get a pulse. Jack spun back to the table. The doctor had unlatched the glass capsule. She was pulling the baby out. The thermal blankets fell away, revealing a tiny body in a white diaper. The baby was limp. He looked like a doll, a broken, discarded doll. Give him to me, Jack said. He didn't wait for permission. He took the baby from the doctor's hands. The child was warm, but it was a feverish, unhealthy heat. The body was dead weight. Jack laid the baby on the stainless steel table, pushing aside the broken pieces of the lock. He had taken first aid courses. He knew infant CPR, but doing it on a dummy was different than doing it on a blue, silent child surrounded by the wreckage of a suitcase. 2 fingers, Jack whispered to himself. Just 2 fingers. He placed his index and middle finger on the center of the baby's chest. He pushed down. 1, 2, 3, 4. The chest was tiny. The ribs felt like bird bones. He was terrified he would crush them. Breathe, Jack commanded. Come on, breathe. He tilted the head back gently. He covered the tiny nose and mouth with his own mouth and gave a small puff of air. The chest rose. He went back to compressions. Titan put his head on the table. He watched Jack's fingers. He watched the baby's face. He let out a low rumble, a sound of encouragement, of urging. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing happened. The baby remained still. The blue tint around the lips seemed to be deepening. Come on, Jack yelled, his voice cracking. Don't you die on me. Don't you dare die after all this. He pumped harder. He breathed for the child. He poured every ounce of his will into the tiny body. Dr. Vance was preparing a syringe of epinephrine, her hands shaking. It's too late, she whispered. He's been down too long. No, Jack said. No. He did another round of compressions. He felt something crack under his fingers. A rib. He didn't stop. Titan barked. Once. Sharp. Loud. And then the baby gasped. It was a terrible wet sound. A sucking in of air that sounded like it hurt. The baby's back arched. His arms flew out in a startled reflex. He coughed, a chaotic sputtering cough that cleared the fluid from his throat, and then he screamed. It wasn't a weak cry. It was a furious, full-throated wail of life. It was the sound of a child who had woken up in the dark and was demanding the light. Jack slumped against the table, tears blinding him. He kept his hand on the baby's chest, feeling the heart hammering against his palm. It was fast. It was strong. It was the most beautiful rhythm he had ever felt. He's crying. Jack sobbed, laughing and crying at the same time. He's crying. Titan didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply stepped forward and licked the tears off Jack's face. Then he licked the baby's foot. The baby kicked out his heel, connecting with the dog's nose. Titan didn't pull away. He leaned into the kick. Dr. Vance rushed in, listening to the chest with her stethoscope. "His heart rate is stabilizing," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "He's moving air. He's gonna make it." She wrapped the baby in a fresh towel, holding him close, rocking him. Jack looked at the empty suitcase, the blinking lights, the tubes, the prison that had almost been a tomb. He looked at Julian Thorne, who was watching with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the baby's cry was the sound of his own life ending. Captain Miller walked over to Jack. He put a hand on Jack's shoulder. He squeezed hard. "You were right," Miller said quietly. "You were right, and I was wrong." Jack wiped his face with his sleeve. He looked down at the floor where his badge still lay. Miller followed his gaze. He bent down and picked up the silver shield. He polished it on his uniform shirt, wiping away the dust. He handed it back to Jack. "You keep this," he said. "You earned it. And him, too." Miller nodded at Titan. Jack took the badge. He pinned it back on his chest. His hands were still shaking, but his heart was steady. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Titan's neck, burying his face in the fur that smelled of airport dust and courage. "Good boy," Jack whispered. "Best boy." Titan let out a long sigh and rested his heavy head on Jack's shoulder. His tail gave a slow, rhythmic thump against the floor. Thump, thump, thump. It was the beat of a life saved. It was the beat of a promise kept. The machine had failed. The law had failed. But the dog had not. Titan's story is a profound reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by technology, bureaucracy, and surface-level appearances, the most reliable compass we possess is often the primal instinct of a loyal heart. We live in a society that prioritizes paperwork over people, where a well-tailored suit and a diplomatic seal can mask the darkest of intentions. Everyone in that terminal, the passengers, the security team, even the doctors, was blinded by the logic of the situation. They saw a medical courier. They saw a violent dog. They let fear of lawsuits and protocol silence their own intuition. But Titan did not care about the man's expensive suit or the lead lining of the box. He did not care about the laws of the airport or the threat of being put down. He heard a heartbeat in the dark, and that was the only law that mattered. He reminds us that true heroism often requires the courage to be misunderstood. It requires the bravery to stand alone against the crowd when you know deep in your soul that something is wrong. Officer Jack Reynolds showed us that loyalty is not just about following orders. It is about trusting your partner when the rest of the world calls them crazy. He risked his pension, his reputation, and his freedom because he knew that his dog possessed a wisdom that no X-ray machine could match. Ultimately, this story teaches us that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by the very rules meant to keep us safe. It takes a pure spirit, one uncorrupted by greed or social pressure, to shatter that illusion. Titan teaches us that the smallest voice, even one muffled inside a lead box, deserves to be heard. He proves that while science can measure temperature and density, it cannot measure the value of a life. Only love can do that. And sometimes the guardians of that love don't have voices to speak. They only have the courage to hold the line until we finally listen. If Titan's unbreakable loyalty touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video to honor the brave canine heroes who protect us every day. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story of courage and survival.